There are tons of manga, and works in general, that we'll find brilliant and in front of which we'll have a good time. But sometimes, some of these works will leave a deep mark on us, make us feel something strong, powerful, or make us think, question thoughts or opinions we thought were fixed, teach us things that will be important in our eyes, and perhaps even contribute to a greater or lesser extent to the construction of our personality, our beliefs, our ideals, and so on. That's what I personally call a masterpiece, even if the real definition of the word isn't exactly the same. And it's often difficult to explain why one work makes a greater personal impression on us than most others. It can depend on the context in which we discover it, be it our age, our mental state at the time, the era, or the way we share it with others. It can also depend on the themes addressed, the messages the work offers us. It can also come from perfectly mastered writing, striking characters, or unique ideas. Finally, it can be moments, scenes, or a simple part of the work that, by its very presence, will bring the work to the pinnacle and sometimes even reveal or highlight its very essence, embellishing everything else about it. And today I'm going to tell you about a work, a manga, that perfectly represents this category in my eyes, as I'm going to explain how, in my opinion, a single page was enough to make Hunter x Hunter a masterpiece. And spoiler alert, this is the page. Or should I say this shot, to be perfectly honest, because yes, I saw it for the first time in the anime. At first it was hard to really understand why this image had made such an impression on me. The death of Komugi and Meruem is certainly as beautiful as it is tragic, is brought to life by an extremely strong Gunji scene, and perfectly concludes the arc, an exceptional arc moreover. But I felt that for a simple image to be so striking, there was something more than a well-staged emotional climax, that there was a real deep meaning behind it, that I had unconsciously grasped, but couldn't put into words. That's why I set out to understand the meaning behind this page, to understand why this scene, more than any other, had made such a deep impression on me. And to do that, I had to rethink the arc as a whole, and the messages it conveys. In fact, right from the start of the arc, chimera ants are presented as a potential danger, but nothing more. They were just something to watch out for, but remained under the control of specialized hunters like Kaito. But in fact, all hell broke loose when a chimera ant appeared that was big enough to eat human beings. Not because human beings are going to be eaten, that's just the first consequence and it's far from the worst, but because the chimera ants to which the queen will subsequently give birth will have human characteristics. And by human characteristics, I don't necessarily mean physical characteristics, but above all mental ones. In fact, throughout the arc, we're shown the worst that humanity can do. We have the state of NGL, for example, which, under the pretext of a return to nature, bans all modern technology and bases the daily lives of its inhabitants on otaki, a return to nature. But in the end, this is just a pretext for isolating the country from the rest of the world and mass-producing drugs. Then there's the Republic of East Goruto, a dictatorship led by a fat pig who is clearly a reference to North Korea. There are also the miniature roses, bombs that are a clear reference to the nuclear bomb, the worst weapon of mass destruction ever created by man. There's also a fair amount of criticism of the men in power and their corruption, such as the guy who was secretly working for Goruto Est, and who will clear himself of his crimes by giving up information in exchange for immunity, even though he's made a lot of money out of all his schemes. Or the Hunter's vice president, who does everything he can to aggravate the situation so that the blame falls on Netero, and so that he can be elected president in the next election, once the affair is over. And of course, there's Gon, the protagonist himself, who becomes truly monstrous at the end of the arc, completely blinded by hatred, and goes on to literally slaughter Pito. In short, all this to say that if chimera ants become truly creepy, it's because they start to humanize, to act like us, to feel a need for individuality, to act according to their own desires rather than for the common good of their species. We'll even see them display gratuitous cruelty as they hunt humans. In fact, they're just more powerful humans, even if they retain some of their ant instinct. And then comes Meruem. Well, it's rather complicated to talk about Meruem without repeating what's already been said 100 times on YouTube, given the number of people who have analyzed him at every turn. But Meruem is a character who finds himself torn between his nature as a chimera ant, which drives him to become a king, the king, and his human nature, which drives him to act according to his personal desires. At first, he really behaves as the king of ants should behave. He'll abandon his dying mother without the slightest emotion and give implacable orders to the others, coldly killing those who don't listen to him. He'll kill humans without feeling the slightest empathy. He realizes his superiority to humans, even finds them stupid and weak, and will probably deny his share of humanity for this reason. He'll develop a plan to reign over all species, and he'll seek to strengthen himself, to become ever better, whether physically by eating people who have mastered Nen, or even intellectually by taking on the best players of board games such as Go, Shogi, or the famous Gungi. And it's precisely at this point that Meruem's humanity re-emerges, thanks to the arrival of a humble, stupid, ugly, blind and weak Gungi player, Komugi. Despite all her faults, Komugi is the first person to find herself superior to Meruem in one way, and that's going to upset him, especially as it's in complete contradiction with Komugi's immense weakness in every other way. And instead of keeping his role as king and eliminating this kind of annoyance, Meruem's human side will finally come to the surface. Curiosity and amusement will take over, leading him to act in ways that are illogical from the purely pragmatic point of view of a king, such as when he rips off his own arm to apologize for his ignorance, or when he lets Komugi stand up to him when she forces him to seek treatment by refusing to play gungi. In short, when Komugi plays with Meruem, she brings out the humanity in him, and that's why Pufu finds her dangerous, because she makes Meruem forget that he's the king. But the real turning point for Meruem comes when she asks him his name, a name he completely ignores. And as he realizes his own ignorance, he begins to question his own identity. And while he will try to convince himself for a moment that he is fully the king of the Chimera Ants, thinking that violence is the supreme force in this world, and that he will go out and kill Komugi to prove it to himself, this vision will fade as quickly as it came to him when he sees Komugi being attacked by a bird. He is astonished at his own behavior, which plunges him back into introspection, wondering who he is and why he came into the world. Then comes his battle with Netero. First of all, if we talk a little about Netero's arrival, it will have a far from trivial consequence. Komugi will be injured by the debris caused by Kirua's grandfather's dragon dive. And just when you'd expect Meruem to go berserk, he has the opposite reaction. He will hold no grudge, no hatred towards those responsible for this attack, and will keep his cool by calmly analyzing. He'll order Pito to heal Komugi and suggest to Netero that he go fight elsewhere. In fact, he is truly acting as king of the ants, but a king who has evolved, who has accepted that Komugi, despite being human, despite being so weak, deserves to exist. And more broadly, that some humans, however weak, deserve to exist. In fact, he understands that the law of the strongest, the only law that exists in nature, the only law he knew at the outset as a chimera ant, is not an effective law in the sense that it leads to the wasting of unique talents that have nothing to do with raw power, but are just as precious in the end. And his reflections lead him to go elsewhere with Netero to negotiate, to explain his point of view. He wants to impose totalitarian power by force in order to create an egalitarian society reserved for humans who deserve it according to his own criteria, basically. And here, even if it seems that it's his human side that's going to drive him to adopt this idea, Meruem isn't going to act as a human, but as an ant, because he's not going to abandon his plan to conquer the world or spare humans as a whole. In fact, he's simply going to take this part of humanity within himself and incorporate it, absorb it, into his ant psychology. After all, that's how chimera ants work, by absorbing the faculties of other species and making them their own. In fact, by rationalizing what he has felt through his human nature in order to pass it off as logical thinking as king of the ants, he will seek to control his own humanity. But he will fail. Indeed, he'll agree to fight Netero, taking part in a pointless battle because, given his obvious superiority, it's a pointless fight with a foregone conclusion. But he's going to do it because of his humanity, because of an irrepressible yet completely irrational desire from the point of view of his species to know his name. A name is the ultimate symbol of individuality, the very thing that gives us our own identity and distinguishes us from one another, which goes completely against the very nature of ants. And this is what will lead Meruem to his doom. Meruem had in fact lost from the moment he accepted this fight, from the moment his humanity took over from his ant nature. In fact, Meruem didn't think for a moment that he could lose, because his birth was the fruit of a long evolutionary process, a joint effort and the sacrifice of countless chimera ants, and the human, symbolized by Netero, would never be able to reach his level despite all the individual efforts he could make, because these are precisely individual efforts, and in terms of quantity, they pale into insignificance when compared with the joint efforts of an entire species. But all these efforts will be symbolically wasted by Meruem's individualism, as he insists on knowing his name. Finally, what really defeats Meruem is the miniature rose. As a metaphor for the nuclear bomb, this bomb is the very symbol of the worst that humanity can do. Meruem, who will be almost dead, will finally manage to survive, will be cured and will even become stronger, but will lose his memory. But despite this, one thing will continue to obsess him: Komugi. When Pufu reminds him that he came here for a duel, the only memory it evokes in him is not his duel with Netero, but the one with Komugi. When he had everything in hand to set his plan in motion, when nothing could stop him, he couldn't think of anything else but the vague memory he had of Komugi and his games of gungi with her. And when he finally remembers her, just by hearing her name, Pufu, whose feelings are now bound up with Meruem's, will be completely shocked by the intensity of what Meruem feels for her, and will realize that it was impossible to stop them from finding each other again. And even when Meruem realized that the miniature rose was poisoned, and that he would soon die, he had only one desire: to join Komugi. On the brink of death, Meruem realizes one thing: his dreams of domination, his role as king, his nature as a chimera ant, his enemies, his allies, etc., none of this matters. All he wants is to join Komugi and play gungi one last time. And that's what he'll do. He'll wake her up and they'll start playing. Then Meruem will tell her that he's doomed by the poison and that if she stays with him, she'll die too. But without the slightest hesitation, Komugi will continue the game. And that's when Meruem finally understands the meaning of her own life. Seeing Komugi place this pawn, seeing her accept death for the sole purpose of continuing to play with him for a moment, he understands that he was born to live this moment, that he wasn't born to rule over all life on earth, that he wasn't born to be a king, but just to play a game of gungi with a weak, blind little girl in a small, unsanitary room. And then comes the conclusion of the whole Chimera Ants arc. There's a sequence of completely black boxes in which we hear Meruem and Komugi playing gungi as Meruem slowly dies. And on the last page, we finally hear Komugi pronounce Meruem's name. Then there's the famous ultra-bright page that contrasts with the black of the previous pages, echoing the name Komugi has just uttered, Meruem, the light that illuminates all, and in which Meruem dies in his arms, before Komugi says she'll be joining him soon. This page alone condenses all the main messages of the Chimera Ants arc for me. It shows us that there is no true supreme force and that greatness is irrelevant. By showing us a being as weak as Komugi, holding in his arms a being as powerful as Meruem, who was even represented as the ultimate life form at the time, we are shown that even the greatest of beings can be carried, supported, by the weakest. This is all the more striking given that Meruem never won against her at the gungi, even though he demonstrated his overwhelming superiority in combat against Netero, then considered the most powerful human being in the fight. And it's not for nothing that when Meruem loses his memory and is told of a duel, the only duel that comes to mind, the only duel that really matters, is not the one against the most powerful human being, in which two worlds, two species, two different visions were pitted against each other, in which he almost died and which, in the end, condemned him to death. No, it was the one between him and Komugi, those simple parts of gungi that had no impact on anyone. Togashi, by showing us that absolute strength doesn't exist, that there are only different types of strength, which is reflected throughout his manga with the complexity of his battles, is in fact showing us that the quest for greatness makes no sense. That the Chimera Ants' very quest, their dream of creating an ultimate being, a king who reigns over all, made no sense at all. And this is what Meruem understands at the very end, when he abandons all this grandeur, abandons his title of king, to simply play gungi one last time, which is why he says that the meaning of his life lies in his final games with Komugi. That he is Meruem and not this nameless king in a borrowed castle, with a bunch of will-less puppets at his command. This page tells us that greatness is just an illusion, that striving for it is completely futile, and that the only thing of real value is our relationship with others, the love we offer and receive from those closest to us. And there's even a biblical interpretation here, as this page is most likely also a reference to La Pieta, a statue by Michelangelo depicting the Virgin Mary holding her deceased son, Jesus, in her arms. Jesus who, according to one of the most widespread interpretations, died for our sins, sacrificing himself by taking human sins upon himself, to be carried away in death. Thus Meruem would be a kind of prophet, who came to remind man what his place is, that nature could break him very easily, but who also died by taking the miniature rose in his face, a metaphor for the nuclear bomb, and thus for what man is capable of worse, as a metaphor for his sins in fact, and would thus take man's sins with him. Komugi playing the role of the Virgin Mary, the mother Meruem never got to know, whose only remaining trace of love was the name she gave him, a name Komugi pronounced just before he died on this page, offering him, in the last moment of his short life, the maternal love he had never known. And even beyond the religious reference, Meruem, poisoned by the miniature rose, certainly shows us that human beings are such dreadful creatures that even someone like Meruem, as powerful as he was, couldn't cope with his infinite malevolence. Komugi, however, represents the exact opposite. By agreeing to accompany him to the end, even if it means dying herself, Komugi represents the very best of humanity, love, sacrifice, and kindness. And by placing Komugi in a superior position to Meruem, by holding him in her arms, she shows that benevolence is superior to malevolence. Because even if human malevolence defeated him, won out over him, it doesn't matter, for even though he bore the brunt of this malevolence, even though he knew he was doomed, Meruem died happy, even finding the meaning of his life, because benevolence will always surpass malevolence, because unconditional love remains above all else. So even though this page is terribly sad, even though it concludes Meruem and Komugi's story in the most heartbreaking way, it is also beautiful, and ultimately offers us a message of hope. The Chimera Ants arc is one of the best written Neketsu shonen arcs I've ever read. It tells so much that we could talk about it for hours if we really went into detail, but for me, it's that conclusion, that famous page which, through its timing and composition, condenses all the arc's main themes and gives them even more power. Like the arc as a whole, this page is a true representation of the human in all its complexity. For what it shows us is that despite all the horror that men have shown, Meruem and Komugi died happy. And it's thanks to everything this page implicitly tells us that Hunter x Hunter is a manga that has had such an impact on me. It's thanks to this page that Hunter x Hunter is, in my eyes, a true masterpiece.